Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here on behalf of Third Way. Couldn't be happier to be joined by Senator Bennet. He is, as I believe everyone in this room would acknowledge, one of the smartest, most thoughtful, intellectually inquisitive people we have in Congress. If we had 534
That's not
or
a very
Michael
high
Bennet's,
bar, I'm afraid.
Yeah, good point. And look, I say this despite the fact that you spell your last name wrong.
I know. I want to get that out of the way.
Yeah, it's awkward.
Yeah.
Tragic loss of a final T happened somewhere.
It's a sad story. You know, I was once riding my bicycle, this is really off topic, with my
Please.
daughter past a graveyard in Denver, Colorado. And I went to look it up. It's called Riverside Cemetery. And when you look it up on Wikipedia, a headstone comes up with the name Bennet, 1T. So I looked it up to find out who this person was, and it turned out he was our first representative to the United States Congress. His name was Bennet with 1T. Not related to me, I'm sad to say. And there is a Bennet, Colorado, a town named after this guy, but they changed it to 2 T's. So
Very sensible.
yeah. Exactly. Is it Matt with 1 or 2?
It's 2. Yeah. I don't skimp.
Okay, well, having said all of that.
Right. So we have a very distinguished group here with us, and we have a large group of folks watching on our live stream. So large, I think Sam Nunberg is calling in later today.
I feel like we're actually, I understand the name Third Way. I feel like these days we're in like the 7th way.
Yeah,
or the 12th way.
It's a strange time. But of course, we're here to talk about advanced nuclear, and you are from a state that knows from energy. You're home, of course, to another national lab, not Mark's, but the NREL, the Renewable Energy Lab. And your state has an incredibly diverse energy portfolio. You get 20% of your generation from renewables, which you've doubled in less than a decade. You're increasing solar deployment, and you have this enormous amount of natural gas. What brought Third Way to the nuclear debate in the first place and to advanced nuclear ultimately, of course, is climate change, as Mark intimated. And that is the thing that really has driven our interest in nuclear, but there's a lot of other things to like about it as well, including resilience. This is a somewhat new space for you, given that your state is involved in all these other aspects of energy. Tell us why you're interested.
I think climate really is the main reason. I represent a state that is 3rd Democratic, 3rd Republican, and 3rd Independent. And it's a state that doesn't have a lot of patience with the partisan politics that are working their way through in Washington, D.C. And 85% of the people I represent, including a majority of Republicans, believe that climate change is real and think we ought to do something about it. And they have been enormously supportive of renewables. That's why we've seen the kind of growth that we've seen, as you mentioned, over the last decade. Our utility and others have helped promote renewables, and we've made enormous progress. It won't be enough to get what we need done on climate. And when I woke up this morning here, blossoms in my backyard were blooming a month before they should. That's the 3rd or 4th year that's happened. In Colorado, our forests are dying. We've got drought. Our farmers and ranchers are challenged by a changing climate. And as the last speaker said, we owe it to the next generation of Americans to make sure we're solving this issue. And if advanced nuclear can be part of that conversation and maybe could bring others to the table to treat climate with the seriousness we need to treat it, I'm all for that.
Well, let me ask you, you mentioned kind of the politics of this, the politics of climate change in your state. Of course, historically, Democrats and nuclear have not gone together all that naturally. There have been concerns about waste, of course, and proliferation and safety. And that has driven many Democrats toward a focus on renewables. But of course, that's beginning to change. Some of your colleagues, like Senators Whitehouse and Booker and President Obama in his last few years, started getting interested in this. What do you see happening in the Democratic Party?
I think there'll be a transition as the technology evolves. We have a bit of a chicken and egg problem, because if we don't have a policy environment that can actually support the investment that's required to be able to do advanced nuclear, we will continue to have skeptics. On the other hand, it's important to be skeptical as well, because we need it to be safe. I saw Harry Reid fight year after year after year against having nuclear waste stored at Yucca Mountain. I don't blame him for that. I would have done the same thing as the senator from Colorado. So that's one of the issues that we have to address is what do we do with waste? Are there technologies that can actually help use the waste? We have some in Colorado that needs to find a home, and it'd be interesting if advanced nuclear could do that. We need to make sure that safety is focused on as well. And I think, like with anything new, having an open debate about it and an open discussion about it will help move us forward. Just drawing a line in the sand and saying no will not help us move forward. And there are some applications for like our heavy power industrial base in the United States that probably can't be solved by renewables because of the heat that's required. Advanced nuclear might be part of that. I think as Democrats understand that, they may come to see that there are important jobs in our economy that may depend on our being able to figure out how to do advanced nuclear.
Well, to your point about kind of hybrid energy systems, of course, you've got NREL in your state, and NREL is partnering with Idaho National Lab on some really interesting and groundbreaking research on low carbon energy systems. And how do you combine perhaps nuclear and renewables to meet some really tough needs, like you just mentioned, high temperature applications for industry, but also like desalinization, that kind of thing. What do you see happening with the future of energy systems? Do you see more of that kind of integration? And to what extent do you think NREL is going to be involved in that?
I think you will see more of it, and I think storage as well will be another part of it that's very important. NREL, I'm biased obviously because it's in my state and I have a parochial interest there, but I used to say when I was first running for office that we believe we invented solar at NREL, and we invented solar in Colorado. It may not have been true, but I said it over and over again. And we lost our edge in some respects in terms of manufacturing to the Chinese. In other ways, we've benefited from that because of at least until very recently, the cheapness or the low cost of solar has created an entire industry in the United States of being able to retrofit. I don't want to see that happen with advanced nuclear. If we don't do the work, China and Russia and France and others will go ahead and lead, and I would like us to be the leader and also be able to deploy it, which means that, sorry for the long-winded answer, we need to invest in our national labs, including in Idaho and in Colorado. The budget that the president presented, which is one that kind of eliminates or dramatically reduces the loan programs and other things for advanced nuclear, is the opposite of the direction we need to go if we think that we are going to be in a leadership position. There's no reason why we can't be. We should be. And the labs are a big part of that. And being able to do the kind of experimentation that you can do there is critical because it isn't done anywhere else. It's not commercial. Having said that, I think there's an important role here for the private sector. And I don't think Bill Gates should have to go to China to get investment in his advanced nuclear company. We should be able to do that here in the United States. That may take changes in our regulatory apparatus. I suspect that it will for that to happen, but that's what we need to do to be able to lead.
Well, of course, we couldn't agree more. This is the third annual gathering that we've done like this. And when I
never was invited.
Well, that is not true. You were busy, but at the first, this community didn't really exist. As Josh talked about in his opening, as you'll hear much more about later today, the advanced nuclear community has kind of formed up over the last few years because the technology has now arrived at a place where it needs Washington. As you noted, it's going to need regulatory help. It's going to need the labs to be fully funded. It's going to need all those things. And one thing I would call to your attention and attention of everybody here is this directory that Third Way and GAIN and the U.S. Nuclear Infrastructure Council put together. These are all American companies that are working on advanced nuclear, and this isn't the exhaustive list. So when you see something like this, how do we go about keeping this technology American? How do we ensure that people build it here and that people like Bill Gates don't have to go abroad?
Well, so it's a number of things. One is we're going to have to figure out together as we go forward what the economics of this really look like. So just as we're thinking about how to price carbon emissions, I think we're going to have to think about how to price waste. Then we've got to figure out how to make the investments, both public and private, that will allow this new industry to grow. And that I mentioned that with respect to the labs, but it's probably true in a number of other dimensions. We have potentially a big workforce issue here if we don't have people that are prepared to do the work that we need them to do, and we need to think about that. So when I passed a bill last year as part of the Defense Reauthorization Act to train veterans to do renewable jobs, there's no reason that advanced nuclear shouldn't have been part of that conversation. It wasn't part of that conversation because we weren't thinking about it intentionally, because you were in your 2.5 year instead of your third year. Now we'll think about it the next time. And then I go back again to the regulatory apparatus, or the regulatory framework needs to be one that actually understands that what we're talking about here is not an industry that's identical to the light water reactors that we're now relying on for our base load on our electrical grid. It's a different technology. And in order, as I said earlier, for people to be willing to make the capital investments that are required in this incredibly capital-intense industry, energy speaking broadly, those regulations need to change. And I think that we can work together to make sure we're doing all of that. The problem, one of the problems that we face, and this is a problem we face broadly, not just here, is that the attention span of people in this town is the length of what happens between 2 commercial breaks on the cable television at night. If that continues to be the case, we will not be able to unleash the imagination that people in this room have, because we will never change the regulatory framework, and we'll never think about the workforce issues, and we'll not make the kind of investments that we need to make. Today, as we sit here, potentially with a deficit that could reach $1 trillion next year because of, in my view, the irresponsible tax policies and spending policies of this administration, we have cut since 1980 by 35% the investment that we're making in domestic discretionary spending. And that includes the investment that we're making in our labs and in new technologies like this. The next generation of Americans and the generation after that are not going to remember us very fondly if we continue on that trajectory.
What do you see as the kind of near-term future for that kind of debate? You noted that the president's budget radically cut some things that we agree with you are vital to the future of this industry and others in the energy space. What do you think is going to happen in Congress? Do you think that money will be restored? Is there relatively broad support for this kind of thing, or is it going to be a fight?
Well, everything is a fight. It shouldn't be, but it is. And I think, you know, it's funny, as I mentioned earlier, my state is a third, Democrat, Independent, Republican. And people don't even really think of themselves that way, but that is what we are. And no matter where I go in the state, if you can have a rational conversation with people, which we often do. In fact, we seldom have an irrational conversation in Colorado.
It must be refreshing.
It is very refreshing.
Yeah.
Come visit, spend your money there. There is a 75% yes consensus around most things, around infrastructure, around K-12 education, around higher education, around infrastructure, and I believe around energy. If we control, our energy future in this country, we will control our destiny. We may have a contribution that we can make to the rest of the world, to the peace in the rest of the world, which would be a useful contribution for us to make. And we may have an answer to the question that a lot of Americans have, which is, can we have an economy that grows and actually drives wage growth as well, and drives economic inequality away? That, I think, partly can be solved through energy, which is why I believe there will be a bipartisan consensus that will emerge here. We saw in the tax extenders bill recently, and at least in the Senate, less so in the House, I'm sad to say, but in the Senate, we saw bipartisan support in the Republican and Democratic leadership for carbon capture bills, for a variety of bills that I think would move us in the right direction. And there's no reason that advanced nuclear can't be a part of that as well.
Well, on that optimistic note, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thanks for
Please
having
join
me,
in.
Matt Bennet. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you. Thank you.